This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 11:08 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast, and you're on Ask a Rabbi.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Loeb of Congregation Eitz Chaim, and this is a beautiful Friday morning. One of my members likes to call it Chamber of Commerce weather. Beautiful weather, a good reason to be in Florida.
Great day for baseball. Oh.
Well, no offense, I'm just as happy when the stadium's not having a game on a Friday night.
That's true.
Because we are located right across from Met Stadium, and it looks like we have one of those 300 people mobs, but it's really the stadium across the street using our parking lot for the people who'd rather walk a block than pay $5.
That's only spring training, though. The St. Lucie Mets don't do that.
Yeah, that's true. The baby Mets don't get quite as much play. The soccer field next door does, though. So lots of different things bring people out, and traffic is not diminished. But so what shall we talk about today? How about giving me a call, 772-340-1590.
I got a question.
Okay.
You have periods of time where you greet people coming in.
Yeah.
Do you hug people? Do you shake hands? Does that change with you a little bit now?
So we do hug, but always with permission.
Okay.
Right. So, you offer the hug, right, which I do with an open hand, and somebody either responds to it or they don't. And I'm still gonna hug if people want to be hugged.
Okay,
and
that's cool.
So let's talk about COVID-19 and its other friend, who's actually far more deadly, the flu.
Oh well, sure, yeah.
Right. The flu has killed in the U.S. somewhere between 12 and 40,000 people this season. The average number for the flu is 60,000 in the U.S.
Yes.
Right, and that's a number quoted right from the CDC website. So here we are, right, we're having panics, and I feel for the people who have COVID. I really do. Flu is deadly for anybody with an underlying condition. We don't take anywhere near these kinds of precautions for it. And you and I were talking right before about how amazing it is that these seem to come up every election year. And, and not conspiracy theory. And as I said to you then, I don't think it's that any group starts it, but I think that once it rears its head, there are certainly people who take advantage of the fact and promote the fear. And there's also people who just like to see people afraid. And,
That's sick.
Yeah, well, of course it is. Of course it is. But there are people who deal in fear. And then there are people who just become much more fearful. And, and I always think about these little systematic, subtle biases that occur. So I'm going to flip to something totally different, which is, women typically change names when they get married. Right?
Yeah.
And you don't think of that as any big deal, but try to go get a license in many states, and they require some serious documentation to prove why you changed your name from your birth name. And who does that affect? Not most men.
Well, yeah, because I would presume you'd have to show your marriage license, right?
You'd have to show any marriage license, and for anybody who's been through a divorce or two, and you've got to show whether or not you changed your middle name, whether you took your last name as your middle name. I mean, there's just a whole raft of stuff that a woman has to go through.
Never even thought of that.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you add the new name at the end of your name so that you keep all of your names? And you have to document which of those choices you made and prove that you did it when you were married. You can't do it 2 years later.
Now,
Right.
what about passports and stuff like that?
All of that stuff, you've got to show that
All of
that you changed all of it. So it's going to make it difficult for women. Now, why would you want to make voting difficult for women?
Oh, come on. Don't go back to the early 1900s.
Well, there's a big reason, because women traditionally vote more Democratic. And so we see these restrictive identity issues in predominantly Republican-dominated states.
Wow.
Yeah. You want to talk about something that's quietly systemic.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right, but these are things that you only see when you go through the trends. Right, and part of that's this prejudice that says women are more emotional, so let's hype up the fear. Okay, but there are certainly a significant number of men who are fear-based as well. You know, but yeah. So, you know, yeah, it's kind of funny. We were at a meeting actually yesterday evening, and it's traditional at the beginning of the meeting that the group actually typically holds hands at the beginning and the end. In the beginning when you welcome everybody, and at the end when you send everybody on their way. You know, it's not an uncommon behavior.
I get it, yeah.
And somebody was like, oh, we shouldn't be doing this. We should be bumping elbows. So at the end of the meeting, instead of holding hands, we just held our hands in front of our bodies. I'm like, okay, so you caught COVID while you're here, you know. We should be taking some of these precautions over the flu. And not just a foreign, and not foreign as in, you know, every season there are new new strains, new flu-like. Now, Ebola, that was one where, you know, did you watch how the people dressed who handled Ebola?
Oh, yeah.
They were dressed in hazmat suits, you know, the little mask. I was in Publix the other day and somebody was wearing a mask, and I seriously wanted to walk up and say, thank you for protecting me from your virus, because the mask, right? Surgeons don't wear a mask to prevent getting sick from the patient.
No.
They wear a mask to prevent their bacteria from getting into the wound. But when somebody's in fear mode, the brain is not engaged anyway. And that's part of the fear mechanism. So let me flip into a little bit of biology here. Your brain stores a little bit of adrenaline, and when you're afraid, it gets released. Why? Because you can't get adrenaline up to your brain from the adrenal gland, fast enough to shut it down and stop it from thinking. Why do you need to do that? Well, in the old days when we used to fight saber-toothed tigers, you had to make a decision very quickly. And people are more immobilized by many decisions. There are people who cannot handle too many decisions. And so being offered 2 or 3 makes it faster and easier to make a decision. Do I fight this saber-toothed tiger? Do I freeze? Do I run? You know, not so many choices. And, you know, whichever one you're going to make, and those who were fear-based survived because they made one of those decisions as opposed to sitting there and wiggling and attracting the saber-toothed tiger. You know, because you got to do one of those 3.
Okay, yeah.
Right? You either have to attack it if you've got something with which to attack it effectively. You either have to run if you're really, really, really fast, or run somewhere where the cat can't find you, right? Or you freeze so that it doesn't see any motion, which is what a rabbit does. You know, I am forever amused in my backyard. If I go out at night, the rabbits are frequently out. And if I shine the flashlight on the rabbit, it often startles it and it'll run, and then my dogs will give chase. But if they don't see the flashlight, the dogs don't usually see the rabbit, and it just sits there absolutely frozen. And they'll come up really close to it, and as long as they don't get too close, the rabbit will hold its ground. And once it moves, my little jackrabbit little dog is right after it. But he'll go up to it and not see it because he's clearly vision triggered, and he'll point at things too. He's humorous. He's a retriever.
The Florida rabbit stand your ground rule.
Right, there you go. But, and I'll see it because I can recognize the cute little bunny ear
Sure. Oh,
shape
yeah.
in my backyard. And I go, I got a rabbit in the backyard. And I sit there and hope that the dogs don't spot it. And I would say that 90% of the time, they don't.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh?
So it's a very effective defense, not against creatures like us who can recognize the shape and see it, but the dogs are triggered on motion. It's that chase instinct.
Sure.
And so, so all of these things were really great back in the day. Not so good the last couple hundred years. As society has evolved and the things that help keep us safe have changed. But we still have a lot of these early prey animal behaviors.
Society has evolved?
Well, to some
Really?
extent.
Oh.
Yeah, well, we've changed a lot of things. Right? We've changed our food habits, we've changed
Into what?
into
Junk food.
eating plastic, yes.
Yeah.
So lots of pieces in there. So, we've got these little systemic things that unless you really look at it, you can't figure out what they're doing. And so there is a benefit for some people to keep a population fear-based. Now, it's interesting because I've had kind of an interesting vignette into this because I teach on the internet Chinese students. And no, you cannot catch coronavirus through the internet. Not yet. Haven't figured out how to send the germs, and we're not going to do that. But, so what China did, China was during their New Year's celebration, which this year happened at the end of January, and the virus surfaced in the Wuhan district, or coming out of the Wuhan district, which is a very congested part of China.
That's a big city.
It's a big city. It's a major hub for inter-China travel. So a lot of people are going to go through it. And, they made the decision to postpone school for students in China coming back. They have a month-long vacation for Chinese New Year.
Really?
Yeah, it's like a big winter break. And it was actually a little bit shortened this year because of where Chinese New Year fell on the Gregorian calendar and their desire to have testing to match to the international world. So they had to balance some of that, and some of the vacations were a little bit short. But with the virus, when that bloomed up, then they shut down the schools because schools are a popular place for flu, colds, and any germ that's in town will travel through the schools.
Were your kids into like what was going on, or did they even know?
Yeah, no, they talk about it. They talk about it all the time.
Okay.
Early on, I'd say at the beginning of February, there was already discussion about whether or not this was going to be like SARS or the bird flu or the swine flu or the this or the that, right? There's a ton of different flus out there, different viral strains. And the viruses are a challenge because we don't have good antiviral medication. Viruses are very hard to isolate because they are biologically much smaller than bacteria. Bacteria are large. Bacteria do well against many antibiotics, although we also have, resistant bacteria now. We're creating superbugs because of a variety of reasons. And so whenever you've got big mobs of people, you, of course, have more transmission. Mm-hmm. And, there's some big church gathering, too, that's being held a bit responsible.
Oh, yeah.
Right, for the transmission of it, because their conferences just happen to match with little blooms of the virus. And, so that is one of the dangers, right? What do you do when you have to deal with these kinds of issues? And it's not an easy answer. There are people who are going to be financially devastated by any measures that are going to take. And, and I'm thinking back, I was a chaplain at Akron General Hospital in Ohio during one of the other flu. It was one of the ones where there had been a vaccine failure or something like that. These all blend together. Mm-hmm. I confess that there's just been so many of these And we seem to have them like, gee, every election. Never mind. They seem to come up. But that particular year, because of the vaccine problems, there was not enough vaccine to go around. Now, it was a requirement that all hospital workers get the vaccine, but it ran out before they got to chaplains. Chaplains are not the first ones to get it, and I wasn't the first chaplain in line because whatever reasons. And so they ran out before they actually gave me my vaccine. And so all I did, and I was in the ER with people coming in with, it was clearly there were people with flu there.
Oh, boy.
And I didn't get it, and I think part of the reason was that I did put an antibiotic antiviral spray on the front of my clothes, and I washed my hands, and I changed clothes when I got home and put them in the washer. So if a little bit of precaution, I didn't take it home. Bill never got it, and nobody that I know of got it. And, I'm hands-on with patients. Now, that's a good point, right? Because one of the questions that we asked in the hospital, and you're going to find people wearing gloves, again, not because it protects the wearer from it, but if I hold your hand and you've got the virus, and then I go to the next room and hold their hand, right, that's a much more likely transmission.
Yeah.
And so, hospitals go through a phenomenal number of gloves, because you take them off, you wash them, you take them off, you wash them. Again, it's not to prevent the person wearing the glove from catching the disease, but it's to prevent the transmission to somebody else.
I was mentioning to Stuart that Carol and I ran into this at the hospital the other day when we were picking up a check for the Christmas kids and at Lawnwood. Mm-hmm. And we're greeted by two nurses outside. Mm-hmm. One of which starts questioning you, and she had a list of questions, and if you passed her test, you moved on to the next one, and they took your temperature, and if it was okay, you go in. Had a lady in front of me who had a high temperature, not real high, but high, and they wouldn't let her in. They said, if you're going to visit someone, why don't you wait a couple days till your temperature goes down.
Again, that would be and if we did that every season for the flu,
right, I get it.
We would cut down on some of the deaths.
I agree.
Because people don't pay attention to things like a mild fever. They push through. Even doctors do, right?
Especially
doctors
yeah.
do.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a trade-off. Do they push through being sick and be there to give their skills to save lives? Yeah. And so, when they are ill, they are wearing masks and gloves. I was watching a woman in a restaurant a few days ago, and she was wearing gloves. And what was funny about that, she was touching everything and touching her face with the gloves. And I'm like, honey, you're not doing anything good for yourself. All you're doing is putting it on the glove.
Certainly, yeah. Oh, my, yeah.
So, and you're going to wonder how you got sick. Again, the glove is not to protect you. The glove is to protect the other people who are in your environment. And so, the mask and all of those things. The surgical sterile field is about the sterile field for the patient. And that's why if a doctor walks into an operating room and they're not cleaned, they'll at least hold up a mask, because the most likely transmission from person to person is from your mouth to somebody else.
Sure.
And that's why, if you're going to sneeze or cough, do it. In your there was a
try and block it in some form.
Right, try and block it, and the best one seems to be to do it into your elbow.
Yeah.
And that's some recent research. It's not the tissue. It's certainly not your hands, which then become little germ carriers.
Yeah, we have
gloves or no gloves.
We have a dear friend who's with the Orlando Magic and basketball team, and he was saying that they hopped on their charter plane and the stewardess, or I should say flight attendant, was very friendly and said, "Oh, we just had the Utah Jazz on this plane." And it was like, uh-oh. And you realize two of those guys had it.
Yeah.
And so same pilots, same flight crew, and they're going, oh, great. And we've got 2-hour flight with these guys, you know. Oh,
well, and hopefully they clean the plane between.
Yeah, hopefully.
And they've learned to do that because people do get sick on flights because you've got recycled air, and it's, some of these things are airborne.
I saw there's something on Facebook with JetBlue where they have this new fogging device, I guess, if you will, that they're using, and apparently that does a real good job. And they can do that in a matter of minutes between flights.
Well, and I think they do it on the cruise ships between cruises, too.
Well, you may,
I'll bet and if they didn't, they will now. There are things that we need to do. And one of the things that was kind of interesting, this is a very big sidebar, but I overheard a couple people talking on the cruise line. I took a cruise in December this year, which you remember because I missed I missed a show because of it. And actually 2 shows. Yeah, it was 2 shows that I missed. And the discussion was this way. When we took the cruise the year before, the buffet had been help yourself, and everybody grabbed the serving stuff and put it on your plate. And you don't really think much of that. And one of the things that I noticed this year when I went on was that only the food servers handled the utensils.
Oh, really?
Right.
Okay,
They had done that change.
I get that.
And I was, I had noticed the change and didn't think anything of it. And then I saw there were a couple people talking, and what they said was that had been a conscious change on the part of Holland America to lessen the transmission of disease. And the people that were talking were saying, I have not sniffled on a cruise line since that happened, since they made that change.
Interesting.
And so there's a little tiny change, because you don't think of these things, but, you handle, you're using the spoon so that you're not dipping into the common bowl.
Right.
And yet everybody's handling the spoon. Right.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. The NBC doctor was talking about that sometimes cruise ships can be petri dishes.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure that's one of the surfaces. And the number of people who walk around touching everything as they go in the ship.
Yeah.
And, and you're visiting a lot of places. It's not even so much that as it is, though, that if you're not used to traveling and you suddenly travel, you don't have the resistance build up to the strains of what's going on in that community. Don't hear it as much. It used to be, right, don't drink the water, don't breathe the air. But Tom
that's
Lehrer.
That's just don't breathe the air in L.A.
Right, Tom Lehrer comes to mind. Yeah, right.
Tom Lehrer.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Pollution, right?
Yeah.
That good old song.
Oh, yeah.
Only 2 things of which you must be aware.
Yeah.
Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air. But we used to worry a lot, Montezuma's Revenge and all of that stuff. That was simply a matter of bacteria that the local population had already become resistant to. And so it didn't make them sick, but you were a brand new organism to those organisms, and they, had a field day attacking you.
What was it Rockefeller used to say? I don't trust air I can't see.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, gotcha. And so so that's part of it too. School teachers tend to get sick a lot the first couple of years, and they don't get so sick after that because they're more exposed to it, their titers are up, they're more resistant. So, and some of these things stay with you, the resistance. You become less likely to become ill. I'm thinking back to a kind of a funny story that my mother of blessed memory used to tell when she was a brand new mother, and my brother was in diapers long before I was here because he's significantly older than I am. But when she went to the doctor looked at her and said, "You're keeping him too clean."
What?
You're keeping him too clean. He will not develop a resistance to disease.
Wow,
Kids,
I've never heard that.
Kids need to get dirty.
Okay.
Okay, I guess she was a little over scrupulous about keeping him, meticulously clean. And the doctor said, no, he's got to have some interaction with germs or his body will never fend them off. So, and the old school, right? If one kid gets sick, you throw them all into the room and just get it over and done with. Right? So, yeah, but, and what's the fear here? The fear is that some small percentage of people are not going to make it through because they have underlying conditions, because they don't take care of it soon enough. They don't, I used to deal with dogs. I'm going to flip into an old dog. We had a parvo scare where parvo took out a whole lot of dogs. And in fact, here's a piece. I have vaccinated dogs against coronavirus for decades. It's not new. That's why it's called 19, folks. It's not 19 because it came up in 2019. Because it's the 19th major human version of corona. Yeah. Right. Corona is a major problem in dogs. Why? Because it looks like parvo, but doesn't respond to the parvo medications. It's a slightly different virus. Viruses tend to have very similar symptoms. And so there's parvovirus vaccines, and there's coronavirus vaccines that you give dogs.
It's funny, Dr. Scheib yesterday was talking about some Chinese herbs that they used to take, hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. Well, echinacea.
Against this. That's exactly
Echinacea
what he
is an
said.
important
Yeah.
one, yeah.
Yeah.
There are herbs that definitely boost your immune system. And, and okay, so I take some of those when I'm going to be traveling. I take it for, up to a week before I leave.
I get it.
During my travel and for a week after. And, knock wood, as they say, that protocol seems to have been reasonably effective. And I have
natural version of airborne, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and echinacea is but the key here is to get really good echinacea, because unfortunately the supplement market is not regulated, and unless you're dealing with a reputable company, what's called echinacea on the label may or may not be echinacea in the bottle.
Yeah. And he said get it from the root, don't get it from the leaf.
Right. And there are some really good companies that do it. I personally take a brand called Activate, but there's several different good ones out there, and that's one that's always worked for me. But again, here's another piece with that, right? If you take this Activate every week, then your system gets used to having it, and then you either need to ramp it up when you need it, or but so here's a piece that I have talked to a doctor that claims that he has treated Epstein-Barr, which is a very, very wicked virus, much more wicked. It's just a lot of people don't get it, but it'll put people in wheelchairs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And with this virus, as with all other viruses, the key is to catch it early, to put yourself on, lots of fluids. Drinking lots of water is one of the best defenses. Wash your hands, drink fluids. Really common sense kinds of things. But getting back to the dogs with the parvo or the corona, the reason we lost the animals that we lost was because of failures of life support or the rapid spread of the virus, as in you got sick and 12 hours later you were struggling. That's the danger, is that there's a very small window in there from contracting it to doing something. Corona doesn't seem to be anywhere near that fast, and this corona doesn't seem to be that fast. Some of the parvos are, and some of the parvo viruses have attacked hearts. And so if there's any weakness in the heart, that leads to that. That's the dog world, and the dog world routinely deals with that, and maybe that's part of my attitude toward it. I dealt with the dogs, and I cared as much about the dogs getting sick as anybody else. Usually it didn't jump to humans. Usually it stayed confined to the dogs. But who wants to lose your entire kennel to any virus? And I dealt with a parvovirus infection. not because we weren't careful and not because we didn't do the right things, but because there was a bad vaccine batch out there where they weren't quite not live.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and so, here you're giving puppies that are the danger for any viruses definitely go after kids. The flu kills many more kids than it does elderly, and certainly many more kids than healthy adults, simply because kids, because they're so actively growing, don't have the immune systems and that's why they get sick in school. Again, because their immune systems are not as well developed, plus they've constantly got their fingers in their mouths. So a couple of things. Wash underneath the fingernails, those kinds of things. Those are basic logical things. And we have a call coming in. Okay, and it is John on line 1. Okay, John. I will go back to my dogs with the parvo.
I have a question for the rabbi veterinarian.
The rabbi veterinarian. No, just somebody who used to race dogs.
You brought up the fact that I don't know if I heard you right, so that's why I'm calling. But there's the distinction a vet would have to make for a dog, whether it's parvo or corona.
Yeah.
So are you saying, now I know corona is a big family, and that's why I wish they would stop calling it the coronavirus, because I guess COVID-19 or whatever that
COVID.
COVID is a better distinction. But are you stating that there is actually a shot that the vet could use on a dog if they have a coronavirus?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that they need to institute life support, which means fluids, and if the animal becomes nauseous, then they're not getting good nutrition, and that's part of the issue too. So they have to put them on a nutrition IV. I've had during the parvo. This was parvo, not corona, so there are some viral inhibitors, but they're not as good as the antibacterials, to my knowledge. And again, I am not a vet. I am not a doctor.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I'm just somebody who used to raise dogs.
You're very knowledgeable, and I'm not going to hold you to it.
She plays one on television, though.
I stayed at never mind.
Stayed at a Holiday Inn.
Stayed at an Express last night.
Yeah.
Yes. But there is a shot for parvo, right?
There is a shot for parvo, and this vaccine, and there's also a vaccine for coronavirus, right?
For dogs.
For dogs, right?
That's what I was asking.
HLLP, HP plus PV plus CV. It's a 6-part virus and leptospirosis and hepatitis and a whole bunch of stuff that you vaccinate dogs against. Hopefully parents are vaccinating their kids against some of these things, but that's a whole nother issue, right?
Uh-huh. But this shot for the corona for the dogs would cover that wide range of other items too.
Yeah.
It's not just specific, and it doesn't have anything to do with the COVID-19 because
that wasn't around. That mutation, and that's part of the challenge with the flu and corona. All viruses mutate every year because they're trying to get better and smarter too. Right? They're alive.
Well, the H1N1 that we had 10 years ago was actually from the Spanish flu, I understand. How we name these things. Which was the swine flu. I mean, it's not identical, but it was a derivative of
they're
the Spanish
they're
flu.
all related somewhere way back.
Yes.
You've got the swine flu, you got the bird flu, you got. I can't even think of all the different. The Hong Kong flu, the Spanish flu,
So if this virus affected, let's say, 60 million Americans, eventually get it, and out of that we have 300,000 hospitalizations, and out of that we have roughly 13,000 deaths.
Okay.
What do you think would happen to America with those figures?
I think that's what the flu is doing this year.
Exactly, and that's exactly what H1N1, the swine flu, did 10 years ago, and I don't remember the stock market going down 30% 10 years ago.
Well, because there wasn't the stopping business.
Well, I know, but the thing is, it was probably, if you run the numbers from the hospitalization and the death, it was 4% death rate. And we're only talking about, and when Fauci says it's 10 times deadlier than the average flu, what he failed to indicate is 10 times 1/10 of 1% equals 1%. So he should have concluded with it's 1%.
Yeah.
Instead of saying it's 10 times deadlier than
Right,
the flu.
yeah.
All he did was create a soundbite for the crazy media to go nuts the other day. And he didn't correct himself properly. He should have, and that's why the Trump administration wanted to keep it to just one person speaking for everyone instead of 5 people saying 5 different things, unfortunately.
Well, there's always going to be many people talking about everything, and the challenge if you only have one is if you have an idiot doing it, then good information doesn't get out anyway.
Well, you might think of it, he's an idiot, but he's going to get his information.
Well, no, I understand.
His information from all of Fauci and the others. The point is, I was in government for 33 years, and we coordinate. We had a media specialist. So we didn't go out there and talk. We referred them to the media specialist. The media specialist would be the one who would gather all the information and present it after going through it with everyone. And that's the way it should be done. Fauci shouldn't be out there speaking on all these talk shows unless it's from the script. And there's nothing wrong with a script as long as
there's
it's got
nothing,
basic facts.
especially not if you're dealing with numbers of people who become sick. All right, there's a couple of different numbers that are used in describing diseases. And for the folks that are on Facebook and aren't hearing the phone call, John is talking about that there needs to be coordinated information and not just everybody having a whole lot of different information coming out about a disease. And that would help because you get what we call telephone going on with the numbers and things like that. But the numbers that you cited were the same numbers that I used earlier to talk about this year's flu outbreak. And part of the issue, again, let me back up. The 2 numbers that are used, that are bandied about a lot, are morbidity and mortality. Morbidity is how likely you are to catch the disease if you're exposed to it. That's morbidity. And it's not 100%. Ebola was very, very high, which is why that was a very scary disease. The flu is not nearly that high. Even if one person infects a lot of people, they're probably really interacting with that person in some way.
I'm glad you pointed that out because I'm telling you, if this was Ebola and Ebola was here and all these numbers were coming out, we had 1,600 cases of Ebola, I would be freaking out. I wouldn't mind if the stock market went down 30%. I would understand that. But what I'm not understanding is the unreasonable reporting and this crazy Armageddon, like it's a Bruce Willis, asteroid movie. I mean, this has got to stop.
I agree, John. I agree. The fear factor in this is just out of proportion to what it is. The flu is many, many more times deadly.
And my wife was a medical reporter at NBC when Dr. Fauci was at UCLA and one of the premier AIDS researchers, and actually probably the first. And he's always been kind of like his own mouthpiece. Now, granted, he's a doctor, he's not a broadcaster, and I agree with what you said. But, to his defense, he didn't finish a sentence the way he should have. But, as far as a researcher goes, he's the best there is.
So getting back to morbidity is how likely you are to catch a disease if you're exposed to it. And corona does not appear to be all that different. The initial numbers were higher, but they're now downscaling them, and it's starting to get more in line with a regular flu. The other point that John made was the mortality, which is how likely are you to die if you contract the disease. And as you pointed out, it's somewhere under 1%, and that's not all that different from the flu. Initial numbers were higher, but they're measuring them down. Part of the reason for that, let me finish this, and then I'll give you another chance to talk, John. But part of the reason for that is that not everybody who contracts the flu or corona or any of these diseases goes to the hospital. First of all, you're not sure. You're not sure if you have it, and if you've got something else, let's say you've just got a common cold, a bacterial infection, you do not need to go to the hospital and get corona from somebody who's sitting there waiting for it to be diagnosed. All right, because you've already got, you've got a compromised immune system. So until your systems become urgent enough to get life support, then, there's a value in self-quarantining and self-treating. And we do have, we have those wonderful things called Theraflu and all those other things. But those are intended mostly to manage symptoms and provide what I would call life support, right? Which is the fluids, the good nutrition, the anti-nausea medications, and those kinds of things, and keeping your organs and monitoring if you need to be interventioned on those things. Not sure that's a verb.
That's the point I was going to make. Not everyone, the data, not everyone is going to be reported. So you have to do a factor down because, like you say, not everyone goes to the hospital. That's why when I mentioned about the swine flu, I didn't mention the 60 million divided by the 13,000 that actually died. I used the hospitalizations because those are the serious cases. Yeah. And those are the ones that determine the true death rate.
Well, so
morbidity is kind of a scary term because when you hear morbidity,
you think of morbid.
You think of death.
Yeah, you think it's morbid. But
I'm glad you brought that up, that it's not actually death.
It's not death. It's how likely you are to catch the disease. And like Ebola was very, very high, the likelihood of transmission. So here's an interesting piece. This is the CDC, as of February 1st, estimated that 31 million Americans have caught the regular flu this year.
I was one of them.
Okay.
Yep.
And, with those, somewhere between 200 to 300 sufferers actually went to the hospital and were hospitalized. Because you have to have symptoms worthy of taking a hospital bed. Thank you, insurance companies. Thank you, limited hospital beds. So there's a whole lot of side information that
and that's regular flu.
That's regular flu.
Yeah.
Right?
But people complain about hospital beds. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to have all these empty hospitals all the time? Government is not there for these kind of things.
Right.
Government can only help ramp up, and that's what they do. They ramp up during a crisis. They ramp down during a crisis.
Right.
It's not like you have all these people ready at your hand.
No. Well, what the hospitals do, and it's a good protocol, so for the folks who don't hear John, he talked about, hospitals can't live with empty beds waiting for the next catastrophe. But what they do is they clear out the elective surgeries or the maybe not elective but postponable. And it's a good time to do that because you don't need folks that have their immune system compromised by the surgery or something like that. In the hospital.
That's like China built a hospital in, 24 hours or 48 hours? That hospital they built out of...
China did an amazing job of putting that hospital together. And what the other part that a lot of people don't know is they put a lot of hotels together as well. Because
that's what you got to do. You got to use cruise ships sometimes.
Yeah. Whatever you need to do.
War.
Yeah.
Whatever. We had passenger ships that we would use for hospitals or transferring soldiers. But one thing Fauci said that upset me was the fact about, when one of our representatives in South Florida, who I won't mention, is grilling him, and where's the test, and where's the test, and where's the test? And he says that we're not geared for that, and he's absolutely right. They're not geared for that. But what it kind of led to believe that this administration was not geared to it. Well, Fauci's been there since Reagan. He's been there as long as Nancy Pelosi and Schumer. These guys crack me up when all of a sudden they have a crisis, and just like I said before, you got to ramp up and you ramp down with government. It's not something you can keep going because we're already $22 trillion in debt. I mean, it would be astronomical to keep this network going when you don't have a crisis every single year. So Fauci should have clarified his statement and said, administrated after administration has not done this for this reason, and give that reason because it's prohibitive for government to do that.
Well, and And so John is saying that governments have to ramp up and ramp down in response to crises. And the other part that I'm still going to come back and say, is this really, is it really a crisis? Certainly China shut it down actually pretty quickly, amazingly. And I started the show by talking about my Chinese students, and they're out and about. They're their society is coming back. They're talking about going back to school. They've also changed their schools to online more.
Can you get on the National News Network and report that for us, please? Because I don't see any of those stories.
Okay. Well, I can tell you, I teach the kids, and the kids take their lessons on iPads. And so how do I know things?
I believe you. I just
how do I know things are going back to normal? There, first of all, the kids are talking about doing things. They're going to their friends' houses. Right, that didn't happen because they were on a total quarantine for a brief period. But they're, and I see the house behind the student when they're taking their lesson, and I know their apartments. Most of them live in apartments. Some of them live in houses, but most of it's apartment because of the city mass numbers in China. And so they're visiting with friends, and I also see them taking their lessons in cars. So I know they're going places.
You can see all this on your phone.
On my computer, yeah, I can see.
Well,
because just like if you look at this on YouTube or if you look at it on Facebook as I'm streaming it, you'll see that behind me on the studio is a beautiful picture of a palm tree and some nice Florida savanna type pictures back there. And you'll see that I wear glasses and a headphone to hear you. And so those are things that you see visually.
So the communists can't clamp down on everything. I mean, it's going to get out eventually, whether things are bad or whether things are good. But what's not being reported is what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And South Korea did a wonderful job too. They're no longer in crisis mode.
Yeah. Well, but unfortunately, a lot of the rest of the world is. And
that's because we got it later, and we're going to go through maybe a 3 to 4 week period, and then we'll be back to where China and South Korea is now, as long as we wash our hands and don't touch our face.
It's just a good flu season protocol. Why does flu break down in the summer? I mean, there's still flu cases, obviously. Morbidity, yeah, but how likely are humidity? Well, a couple of things, right? Sunlight too, and the amount of people getting out and being healthier. So lots of things play into these. What can I say?
But I'm going to get off the phone. I don't want to filibuster, but I enjoyed your program last week, and maybe next week you can get into some more about the Bible and eating correctly. No, I don't mean to be funny. I mean, it was very interesting, and everybody laughs at some of the things in Leviticus, but there's a reason for some of this stuff.
Yeah, well, some of actually, it's kind of interesting. John just brought up Leviticus, so I will do a brief little bit of Bible.
And I'll listen to you on the radio. God bless.
Okay, thank you, John. And I'll offer that if you're like John and you like this, please consider sponsoring an episode or 3 or 4 of Ask a Rabbi. Please contact the radio station or contact me at the temple. We can certainly arrange for that, and I love sponsors. So John had raised the question of Leviticus, and I've got just a few more minutes so I can do that. Leviticus has in it a couple of different protocols that are important, which is a discussion of skin infections, usually called leprosy, but they're not all leprosy. And there's a protocol in there about how to look at the eruptions on the skin and determine whether or not it's infectious. Look at the clothing and see if infection's in the clothing, because people would use other people's clothing.
Sure.
And also even just look on the house and the parts of the house and see it. And, when I've talked to nurses and doctors today, they tell me that those protocols are really pretty good. And so we do have another caller coming in. Bob on line 1. Thank you for calling, Bob.
Thanks, Rabbi. With your previous caller, you were talking about why flu doesn't permeate itself so much in the summer. People do get it, but not as much. And you said that one of the reasons for it is the sunlight, the warmer temperatures. I remember one day when I was in school, it was absolutely bitter cold. If it was 20 degrees out, it was warm. And we went to class with this one teacher. It was a science class, and we got talking about the flu. And the science teacher, or one of the kids, said to the science teacher that this was healthy weather. And the science teacher said, you're absolutely right, it is healthy weather. And I raised my hand and I said, if it's such healthy weather, why do they call this the cold and flu season? And the science teacher said to me, well, they do that to advertise Dristan or Contact or Sudafed or whatever.
Okay. So Bob is saying that his science teacher said that they advertise the flu in the winter so that you'll go out and buy Dristan.
Bob, I'm shocked. Shocked you would say that.
Yes. Nothing like well, maybe it was the mask manufacturer. Never mind.
That's right.
There are certainly people, and I'm not going to say that people cause these things, Bob, but yeah, there are people who do take advantage of a situation. I think part of the reason why one of the things that people don't think about, clean your toothbrush. In my house, one of the things that we did to cut down a long, long time ago, and it's got recycling and landfill issues associated with it. But we use disposable cups, and my husband and I don't share the toothbrushing cup, so that we don't share something if one of us gets it. But cleaning your toothbrush, because that's one of the ways you bring it back to yourself. So here's my advice for the world, the rabbi who is not a doctor, not a veterinarian, simply somebody who once raised dogs. And it is stay healthy, wash your hands, drink plenty of fluids, stay healthy. And talk to you next week. This has been Rabbi Shafir Loeb for Ask a Rabbi. Thank you, Bob and John, for calling.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL Port St. Lucie, WPSL.com, webcaster to the world.